Welcome back to Two Peas in a Kitchen. We are excited to show you guys how to make sourdough in this series of ours. And this is the first of 2 episodes on sourdough starter. So we have some right here, but we're going to show you how you can make your own sourdough starter. So we actually have, this is an old starter that we got from a class that we took. But if you don't have a friend that can share their starter, we're going to show you exactly how to make your own starter. So first of all, what is a sourdough starter? So a sourdough starter is basically fermented flour and water. Plain and simple, that's all it is. Now we're going to use simply bread flour and water to make our starter, and then you have to keep feeding it. Think about it as being your pet for a few days until it's ready, and we're going to show you all the steps. Now there are many recipes for sourdough starter. This one is simple. We chose to keep it with just white flour, white bread flour and water. Some people use rye and whole wheat flour, but we wanted to keep it simple. So what is the difference between a regular yeasted bread and sourdough bread? This is where it gets interesting. So regular yeasted bread, now you may have watched many of our other videos where we've made our country bread, which is very popular, and it uses an active dry yeast, such as this Red Star yeast. With sourdough bread, you don't have to purchase yeast ever again. You can keep a sourdough starter indefinitely if you store it properly and you feed it regularly, which we'll go over all that soon. So you may ask, what then makes your bread rise if you don't add your yeast? So throughout the process of creating your starter, there are actually wild yeast and bacteria present in both the flour and in our surrounding air and environment. So that actually gets captured in our starter and it makes your bread rise. So throughout the process, carbon dioxide is produced in your starter, and that's what makes your bread rise. Okay, so now let's get into the actual steps of making your sourdough starter.
Today is day 1 of creating our sourdough starter. We are adding 50 grams of all-purpose flour and 50 grams of water. After stirring these ingredients, we will place a silicone lid on the bowl, and then we will place it on a kitchen counter where it will sit for 24 hours. On day 2 of creating our sourdough starter, you can see that the mixture just appears a bit pasty and thick. Again, we are going to add 50 grams of all-purpose flour and 50 grams of water. After stirring these ingredients, we are going to place the silicone lid back on the bowl, and it will sit on the kitchen counter for an additional 24 hours. On day 3 of creating our sourdough starter, the mixture is starting to have a few air bubbles. Yay! Again, we are adding 50 grams of all-purpose flour and 50 grams of water. After stirring these ingredients, we will again place a silicone lid on the bowl, and then we will place the bowl on a kitchen counter for 24 hours. On day 4 of creating our sourdough starter, just look at this. The mixture is starting to really have some action, and you can see even more air bubbles. Hooray! Again, we are adding 50 grams of all-purpose flour and 50 grams of water. After stirring the ingredients, we will again place the silicone lid on the bowl and place the bowl on a kitchen counter for 24 hours. On day 5 of creating our sourdough starter, look at that. The mixture is continuing to really have some action and lots of air bubbles. Also, there is a strong sort of acetone vinegary odor from the initial fermentation. Again, we are adding 50 grams of all-purpose flour and 50 grams of water. After stirring, we will again place the silicone lid on the bowl and place it on a kitchen counter for 24 hours. Okay, we are here on day 6 with our sourdough starter. So I'm going to show you here what it looks like. I have it in this glass bowl so that you can see. And I had moved it into this glass bowl so you could also maybe see the bottom. I'm not sure how easy that's going to be to see in there. But we have a sourdough starter here that is really doing great. It's nice and bubbly. It has sort of a vinegary, almost acetone odor to it, which is exactly what you want to have. And so things are bubbling along. Haha, get it, honey? Because as you can see, as we've been adding the flour and the water every day, it's been getting more and more voluminous. We've decided that we're going to divide this now on day 6 into 2 jars. One is for Rafi, one is for me, ultimately when we're done. So the first thing that I did before I put any of the starter into the jar is I weighed the jar with no lid on it and with nothing inside of it so that I knew the base weight, which is going to be very important as we begin to add flour and water into our jars. So I weighed it, and then I took a Sharpie and I wrote the weight of the jar on the bottom of the jar. It's a really good habit to get into as you keep a sourdough starter and you're going to be feeding it along the way in our journey to making bread. So this jar weighed 245 grams, so now I know what my base weight is. What we decided to do is we took 40 grams of our day 6 starter and we have gone ahead and put that 40 grams into each of our jars. So I now know that I have my jar with my 45 grams of starter, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding 40 grams of flour and 40 grams of water twice a day into our jar. And what we're looking for is eventually it's going to start bubbling and it's going to start doubling in size. The only way we're going to know that it has actually doubled in size, because that's the end result that we need to know that we have a viable starter, is by keeping a piece of tape on the top level after I put in the flour and the water. So I'm going to mix in my flour and my water in this jar, and then I'm going to show you how I use the tape, and then we're going to talk about what we're going to be looking for to see if our starter is viable once it's done. So I'll be right back to tell you more about how we're going to mark the jar and look for the viable starter. Okay, so I added into each jar 40 grams of flour. I'm using bread flour, but you can use all-purpose flour when you're feeding your starter. That's perfectly fine. So I've mixed in that, and I've done this in each jar. The second jar is the same thing. I added the 40 grams of starter, 40 grams of flour, 40 grams of water, and I'm just mixing that up a little bit. And then what we're going to do is, get rid of this spoon here. We're going to take a piece of blue tape, and I'm going to mark the top point, however you can do that. I'm just going to mark it with, this is the bottommost point of my tape on each of my jars. And that is going to show me where the starter is at the beginning of this feeding for the starter. And I'm going to put a mason jar lid, these are mason jars, loosely on the top, not too tight. And I'm going to wait 12 hours, and then I'm going to repeat it. And what I'm going to do at that point in time is I'm actually going to start a process where I'm going to be discarding some of the starter at the beginning of each feeding. We always want to start with 40 grams of starter in the jar. So when I come back to the next feeding, I'm going to remove all of it except for 40 grams. And that's why it's so important to know the weight of your jar, so that you can discard, you can add 40 grams to the amount of weight of your jar, and you know exactly how much you want. And then you will refeed it again with 40 grams of flour and 40 grams of water. After a couple of days, what you're going to notice is that your starter is going to start getting more and more bubbly, more and more active, and it's going to start to grow. When you get to a point that your starter grows, that it is doubled in size from where you are marking with your tape, and it is also bubbly, so we're looking for doubly and bubbly, and also it has sort of a kind of sweet vinegary smell to it. And in addition, if you take a teaspoon of it and you put it into water and it floats at the top of the water, that's called the float test. You know at that point in time you are done, you have a viable starter, and you're ready to try to use it. When you start baking with that, it's going to take a little time to get perfect. We're going to talk about that next week, and we're going to give you a lot more information about how your viable starter is going to look when it's done, how to bake with it, what to do with it, and that's all going to be coming out next week in our next second episode about sourdough starter. But for today, we've accomplished a lot. We've got 2 jars. We're ready to start feeding twice a day, and we'll see you next week to talk about the completion of our sourdough starter and show you all what it looks like and what the next few days process looks like in the video, so you'll be able to follow along.